Hello, everybody. I'm Jeff Banks, and I'm going to be hosting today's event. I'll also be one of the speakers at today's event. What we're talking about today is study skills and time management. And joining me today in talking about these topics are Anna Kiefte from the Department of Physics, Jamie Sedgwick from the Department of History and Classics, and Mary Sweatman from the Department of Community Development. So our first speaker is going to be Anna Kiefte, and she'll take us in as soon as I get everything set up here. I'm also producing today's event, which Anna helps me with. And so here we go. Here's Anna coming now.
Hi everyone, welcome back to another orientation session. I hope you've all been having a great week so far. So today, as Dr. Banks mentioned, we're going to be really talking about time management and study skills. So what I just want to start off with is just to sort of say, each of us is a whole person and we all have lots of commitments, we have responsibilities and varied interests. So how do we balance those competing pressures? Or how do we focus on what's most important each day, each week, each season, but not drop the balls on any really critical things? So obviously we have to adapt things and we have to pick up things and let things go at different times and prioritize certain things at different times. But how do we do that? So we're going to today be talking about some different aspects of both time management and study skills. And all of us sort of have different takes on this. So I'm going to start it off with a few kind of overarching themes and ideas, and then the others will continue on going more in depth with some of them as well. So one thing you probably are reflecting a little bit on right now, especially as you're starting another chapter of your life. Most of you, I think, are going into your first year. Some of you may be further along in your university studies, but one of the things you may be reflecting on is what commitments, responsibilities, and activities do you have? One of the things you really want to start to think about and really think about at different points. So, in a given week or in a given semester or in a given year, you want to think about what of those things is critical and what of those things can be kind of negotiable. So could you actually drop for a while if you had to, that kind of thing. So some of those commitments and responsibilities might be deadlines you have to meet, like lab reports or papers that are due or assignments or different things, presentations, things like that, things that are deadlines that have a specific time they need to be submitted. Appointments, like medical appointments, health appointments, of a variety of types. You may have some chores or other personal or home-related tasks that you need to do. Depending on what your circumstances are. So you might, if you're living in residence, it may be more things like making sure your laundry is done, making sure you have, snacks you might need, stuff like that. But mostly, some of you may be living off campus or living at home, for example, and you may have regular chores or responsibilities at home that you want to think about and remember. Do you have tests or exams you need to study for? So preparing in advance for those things. Do you have hobbies that are really important to you and you find really important for your well-being, but also for stimulation and fulfillment? Do you have social or personal plans? Do you have plans with friends or loved ones? Those kinds of things. Do you have general coursework you need to do? So not so much things that have deadlines, not so much tests and exams and things like that you're studying for sort of in the moment. But what about things like readings you need to do for a course or other general practice for a course that you may be doing? Things that aren't necessarily being assessed on a day-to-day basis, but that you really need to do in order to be on top of your course, to prevent yourself from getting into sort of a cramming cycle, because cramming for all your courses is not going to be healthy. It's going to be really stressful, and it's also not going to help you retain that information really effectively. What are some practices and performances or games you might be involved with. So if, for example, you're involved with a varsity sport or involved with a club sport, or maybe you're involved with a music group or a dance troupe or something like that, you may have performances or games or practices that you need to be committed to. Maybe you're involved with a volunteering commitment. So maybe you volunteer at a hospital or you're part of a club that does service. Are those things things that are critical to you, or are they negotiable? Maybe you have children or parents or someone else in your life that you need to care for. Or maybe you have animals that you need to care for, and sometimes that is a responsibility as far as, you know, walking a dog or making sure a cage is cleaned or whatever. So these are all different things that you're responsible for potentially. And this list, probably nobody here on this call has all of these responsibilities, but I'm just trying to sort of encourage you to think a little bit about what your life is about and what some of those things are that you might have to, you know, put aside for just a short time, or maybe they're things that you used to enjoy and you don't anymore, or maybe they're things that you want to maintain every day in your life. Meetings, so meetings with, you know, a professor or with a classmate, something like that. And if you work, if you have shifts at work, part-time jobs, things like that. So during my university years, I was involved with some of these things. For example, I pretty consistently had part-time jobs during my undergrad. I was involved with volunteering quite consistently. I was in a choir. I certainly had friends and did things with them, especially on weekends. But I was pretty committed to my studies as well. And one of the things you really need to do is decide, okay, what is the core, what are some of the core responsibilities that you have, and what are some of the things that you sort of fit in as things to sort of fulfill and stimulate you, so to speak, as I said. So just in terms of planning out some of these things, in order to get things done, but also in order to be happy, to be content, and to be fulfilled, one of the things you can do is at the beginning of a term, and this would be right around now or in the next couple of weeks, once, you know, your course syllabi and different things become available to you, you want to enter in all of the deadlines that you know in advance. So for example, if you know you have midterm tests, or you know you have projects due, or things of that nature, and they're all scheduled, they're often, and they are almost always, I should say, in the syllabus at the beginning of a course. So you can at least put some of your deadlines into your calendar right away. And whether that calendar is, you know, something like this, just a paper calendar or agenda, whether it's a book that you write things in, like lists and things, whether it's your computer Outlook calendar or some sticky notes on your computer, whatever it is that works for you, you want to develop some kind of system to enter those deadlines into something that you will actually refer to on a regular basis. You also want to think about those responsibilities that you have. So I listed some possible responsibilities on that last slide, and I just want to reiterate that, you know, some of them are negotiable, some of them aren't. So you really want to have a good handle on what for this term those responsibilities are. Think about what teams, clubs, hobbies, jobs, or volunteer groups you'd like to be involved with this term. So, you know, you really do want to think about not only what you'd like to do, but also maybe what are the more important ones for you. So you might not have a full idea of that yet, because there's, you know, often activities in the beginning of the term to sort of show you what some of the options are and that kind of thing. So this might come a little after some of the other things, but that's why I suggest that this beginning of term period is really a couple of weeks, and you want to kind of start reflecting a little bit about what this season has in store for you. So when we look at the big picture, that's sometimes really helpful, or for a season or a term, but sometimes it's also really helpful to look at the upcoming week and think a little bit about what some things are that you have on your plate on a shorter term basis. So some of the things I would recommend as a strategy would be listing all your courses and what needs to be done for each of them that week. So sometimes those things have deadlines and sometimes they don't. So sometimes it's actually an assignment that's due, or it's a paper or a presentation or an exam or test. But other times it's just, like I said before, it's sometimes keeping up with work and making sure that you're doing the readings that are recommended or required, or making sure that you're practicing. So if you're taking a course that involves performance of some kind, whether it's physical, athletic performance, or whether it's musical performance or theater, and learning your lines, for example, you want to make sure you're doing things consistently. So that is something that should be worked into every week, and really every course, every week, you should be touching on every course. Some weeks you're going to be working more on certain things than others because of work patterns and all of that, but really you should never ignore a course for more than a few days at a time, because that will really come back to bite you, frankly. So keeping up is really, really important. And as I mentioned already, really check the syllabus. It's not a bad idea to check it, every week or every couple of weeks, to make sure that if your professor has given you kind of a guideline around recommended readings every week, or recommended videos to watch, or whatever the mode of delivery is, it definitely is beneficial to check that syllabus to make sure that you're not missing anything, and that you're sort of, at least relatively on top of the schedule that your professor has recommended. A lot of thought goes into these plans, and we really do try to ensure that the amount of work we're assigning is reasonable for our course, so that, again, if you're working on all of your courses, whether it's 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 courses a term, that you are able to bite it off in sort of bite-sized chunks, so to speak. So again, at the beginning of each week, I've kind of focused that first slide, I was focusing mostly on school, right? But there's all kind, like we talked about before, there's other things. So you might want to ask yourself in a given week. Every week does not look the same. So you ask yourself things like, does your friend have a birthday? Are you planning to go have supper with a friend for their birthday? Or are you planning to go to a party or something? Are you planning to go and get that friend a card or a gift or something? Those are all things that you kind of need to think about. Did you promise your roommate you'd clean the bathroom? Honestly, those things are important too. In order to have harmony in your household, if you're living with other people, you want to make sure you're holding up your end of the bargain. And sometimes those things need to be written down so that you're actually, being a good citizen of your household. Do you need to catch up on laundry? Do you have any appointments? Do you have any shifts at work? Are you traveling for a tournament? Is there an event you really have been looking forward to and you want to make sure you have time to go to it? Again, these are not, I'm not trying to be exhaustive with the list. It's just thinking about some of those things and remembering that those are things that will vary from week to week. So then, again, drilling down the time frames a little bit. At the beginning of each day or the night before, I actually tend to prefer the night before myself, but that really depends on the day and the week and all of that. But choose 2 to 5. I'm just kind of picking a number here, but the idea is you want to pick a reasonable number of priorities. They should actually be priorities. Those priorities are going to vary in terms of the number you pick every day, because it's going to depend on how much of your day is scheduled. You might have certain days of the week where your day is really open, like there's not a lot of really formally scheduled things. And then there'll be other days where, 8 or 10 hours of your day is scheduled for you with classes or labs or meetings or job shifts or volunteer commitments at the hospital or wherever you are. The point is it really does depend on how much of it is scheduled. So you want to sort of look at a day on a day-by-day basis. You also want to think about those priority tasks and think about how big they are. Are they things that will only take you half an hour to do, or are they things that you really need, a good three solid hours to complete, for example? So think realistically about that. Also, how are you feeling? What I mean by that is, are you suffering from a cold right now? Are you having a bit of a blue few days? Are you just generally, achy or in pain because you've trained really hard, over the last couple of days? The point I'm trying to make is just you really need to be self-aware about how much you can handle on a given day. And that kind of thing is really important because you want to set yourself up for success. You don't want to set up unrealistic expectations for yourself because that's really, really hard on your psyche, honestly, if you're constantly not meeting your own expectations of yourself. So you really want to try to pick a reasonable number of priority tasks so that you're succeeding at meeting that reasonable number of tasks and so that you're relatively on top of things. It's very natural and normal, and we all feel behind on things regularly. But again, staying on top of a reasonable number of those things is important. The other thing, I just want to touch on this. Dr. Banks is going to talk much more about learning styles and things like that, but I just want to touch on this idea of what studying style you're using in a given situation. So when you're studying, you want to think about what kind of course it is. And also you want to think about what kind of assessment you're preparing. So it could be that you're, and when I say assessment you're preparing, it could be a presentation, or it could be a test, or it could be getting ready to write an essay. You know, I'm just using the term studying in general to mean working on a course. So for a given assessment, will you be asked to identify facts? So just as examples, you know, if you're in a certain course and you're asked to be able to name the parts of an organism's body, for example, or if you're asked to name the dates that certain historical events occurred. Those are all things, or you're asked to list vocabulary words if you're doing a language course. You know, I'm just picking some things here that are task-oriented, fact-oriented, pardon me. Those things, when you're learning those things, sometimes it's helpful, and a lot of you probably have developed strategies over the years, so use the appropriate strategies. So maybe it's things like making up mnemonics for things. You know, if you're trying to remember how to do trigonometry, some of you may remember SOHCAHTOA, for example. That's a mnemonic to remember the trigonometric ratios. You know, if you're trying to remember a certain cycle in a biological or chemical process, you might create a mnemonic. You might make flashcards and do it with a friend, or do it with your, you know, use the flashcards yourself. You might rewrite notes in that case, because sometimes rewriting your notes by hand does help you remember things. Another type of thing you might be learning is, will you be asked to solve a problem you've never seen before? Maybe you're working on stoichiometry problems in chemistry, or maybe you're working on some math problems or some physics problems. Just as some examples. So for those, it's not really as useful to rewrite notes or to come up with memorization strategies. It's more useful in those cases to sit down and work on fresh problems and do things you've never done before to try to learn them, right? Will you be asked to synthesize themes and ideas by comparing, contrasting, and linking things you've been learning? So maybe you've been reading things and you're doing a course in literature or a course in history or in politics, and you're expected to remember how certain things interacted with each other in the past, or how some different literature pieces you've been reading have thematic similarities and differences, you know, all of these things. You may, in those cases, find it helpful to revisit some notes you've made in the margin of a book you've read or an article you've read, or maybe you find it useful to look at some notes you've written. So in those cases, that would make for some effective learning. Having a conversation with someone who's in the course and thinking about your big ideas might be useful, you know. Will you be asked to present something with a group? You know, in that case, working and studying may be preparing your part of a presentation. So again, you want to really think about what is the effective type of strategy that's useful in this case. I would say that I often encounter students. My main teaching focus here at Acadia is physics. And what I would say is my experience teaching physics in particular is that sometimes people spend a lot of time rewriting notes, and that's not always an effective and efficient use of your time. I would say reviewing notes and looking at things you've done before is useful, but mostly it's more useful to actually sit down and, you know, really try to work on problems you've never seen before. Whereas some other courses that I've, you know, taught before, been involved with before, there are more sort of fact things that are expected that you know. And so for those, maybe it is more about learning strategies for remembering and recalling information. So you really do need to, you know, change the kind of work you're doing based on the course you're doing and the assessment type you're preparing for. Another thing, just as a tip for some of this work, and studying goes, you really want to try to find a space where you can focus and remove some of your distractions. Really try to work when you're working, and then take breaks to do things like check your phone or have a chat with a friend or take a short walk to stretch. You know, try to really work while you're working. So there's lots of time to take breaks, there's lots of time to have fun, but if you focus when you're focusing, so to speak, you'll be much more successful. Another thing, something that I often say to my students is one of the things I really got out of my undergrad was figuring out when good enough was good enough. So one thing is you can't always finish everything when it comes to your university studies, or at least you can finish it, but maybe not to the level of completion that you're accustomed to. So you may have to learn how to submit work that's not finished or not as polished as you'd like. So you just really want to remember that that's okay, and that's actually just a strategy in life, frankly. It's the same way in workplaces. You know, you're always going to have deadlines to meet, and you're going to have to meet the expectations of your supervisor and all of that. But sometimes things get more deep completion and sometimes they're more like just get it done to get it done kind of jobs, right? So you're going to sort of over time learn how to get to the right level when it comes to that. And we're not always going to get that right, but that's something to aim for, is that comfort with submitting work that's good enough. The other thing is some courses, especially the ones that don't come as naturally to you, may take you more time than you're accustomed to. So you might have to adapt how much you're involved with outside of courses. The other thing is it's normal to have some courses take you more effort than others because they either might just be heavier courses, but they also might be things that for you are more challenging. And again, Dr. Banks is going to talk a lot more about learning styles and knowing yourself and such, but I just want to say it's normal. It's normal for courses to take different amounts of time for you and for your classmates and friends, because it's always going to depend on your strengths and what you need to work a little harder to achieve. And then the other thing I just want to say is, again, focusing on your goals is important, but your well-being is more important. One of the things that kept me going when I was doing my undergrad was several days a week I went to go swimming at the pool. And I wasn't involved with the swim team, but I would go and swim laps for somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes several times a week. And that's something I haven't been doing lately, and I really should be doing that because it really was good for me. And that's the point. It's really just good for me and good for you to do things that are good for your well-being. So eating good meals, eating food that's, you know, good for your body, getting enough sleep. Last week, for those of you who are in the session with Dr. Fowles from the School of Kinesiology, he really talked about sleep quite a bit, and it really is important. So, you know, see loved ones and friends or talk to them depending on where you're located. You know, make sure you're taking time for those things that are good for your well-being. And then again, just some thoughts. Make time for fun and fulfillment outside of your courses and make university memorable. Try to find balance. Balance is a little bit of a moving target, and I think all four of the panelists would, you know, agree with that statement that balance is, you know, it's a bit of a joke to say everybody's, you know, getting balance, but you can at least aim for balance. So you need to make time for the rest of your life, but really remember that university is a priority right now, or if you're here and you really want to succeed, it should be a priority. So you really do want to give the courses the time they deserve and that they need. Another thing just to note is you really do want to mix up the types of activities you're doing for fun. So one trap people can get into is going out really late several times a week. It's really good to go out and have fun with people and to, you know, sometimes those nights are late. Like sometimes you won't get home until 1 or 2 in the morning, and that is so normal and it's fun and it's all good and it's good to have those nights sometimes. But sometimes those times with friends might be getting together and having a potluck or, you know, cooking pizza together or going and watching a movie together or sitting around and, you know, doing Netflix, like whatever it is. Sometimes it's low key. And it's okay to have some of your fun times be low key. When I was in university, with the exception of when, you know, it was final exam time and we were all kind of head to the books, so to speak, I would say I think pretty much all, other than those really, really crazy busy times, all Friday and Saturday nights, I was doing something, and whether it was something fun. So whether it was me, myself on my couch chilling out, or whether it was seeing a friend and playing cards or a game, or going downtown and having fun at, at the pub or the bar or whatever, or going to a party, it was always something, but it wasn't always the same kind of thing. Sometimes it was quiet and restful, and other times it was out and having a really, more of a wild time, so to speak. And you really do want to try to find the balance in that. The other thing about university is take the time during this time to learn about yourself and learn about what makes you tick. So what gives you energy and what gets you up the next morning to, go do that next thing that you need to do. So what keeps you moving along and living the life you want to be living? And that's going to look different for every one of us. And it's really important that you find for yourself what that means. And set yourself up for a bright future. And again, try not to waste the time you have here at university. If you can try to do your best so that your future is bright in terms of opportunities you might have, if you can, be reasonable with your money so that you're not dealing with debt for decades down the road. If you can take care enough of your body so that your body is doing well a few years down the road, all of that. These are all important things. And finding as much balance as you can, but recognizing that there is going to be stress is really, really, what I would just say in terms of trying to live the life you want to live, but take advantage of this wonderful time here in university. So that's pretty much it for me. Thanks for your time. I hope you have a wonderful remainder of the session. You're muted, Jeff.
Thank you, Anna. Sorry, I lost my, what did I lose? I lost my mic and then I lost my Windows, but here I come. So thanks a lot, Anna. It's interesting that all of us, when we looked at each other's slides, there's some overlap in what we're talking about, the things we're touching on. And one of the things that I feel is important, I'm going to be talking a little bit about learning today and how we learn. And I'm starting this off with know yourself. It's important to know yourself, and it's important to know your tendencies. So one of the things I know about myself is that I'm a bit of a procrastinator. I've learned that it's actually my process. One of the things I do, there's a lot of work that goes on in the back of my mind while I'm procrastinating. It is going on, and I am really good at hitting deadlines, but I'm also really good at working at last minute. Now, if you're that type of person, it can work for you, but if you're not, it can't work for you. And that's why it's important to know yourself. The other thing, so I just have some things up here, how to feel like you've done something. One way to do that is to make to-do lists, and I have an example to-do list here, where you make your to-do list, then you can check that off. You check off the first thing on the to-do list, another check. So you have to be careful. You have to know yourself, and you don't want to fool yourself. That's one of the things that we're going to be talking about today. So let's go on, and I'm going to talk a little bit about setting realistic expectations. And I want to be really careful here because you have to have realistic expectations, but you don't want to put yourself in a box. You don't want to think about it in a fixed mindset sort of way. You have to realize that the way things are now is not necessarily the way things are going to be. But when I say set realistic expectations, for example, if you've been going to class and done nothing else, you haven't done the homework, you haven't done any studying, you should expect that you're not going to get an A on a midterm or some sort of assessment. You need to work at that. And that's what this little cartoon is trying to convey. What they're sitting around a desk and they say, what if we don't change at all and something magical just happens? Sometimes I think we have that expectation that we can just go to class and then we'll know the material, but there's a lot more work to it than that. That's one of the things I'm going to try and get across today, is that learning is not necessarily easy. It may come easier to some folks than others, but it's never easy for everyone. And if it is easy, you're probably not learning much. you have to put some work into it. One of the things that I think is really important is to have a growth mindset. A growth mindset means that we realize that what we know today is not necessarily what we're going to know tomorrow. We learn through our failures, and intelligence isn't a fixed trait. So if you have a growth mindset, you're going to take advantage of your failures as learning opportunities. You're going to realize that you may not have done well at something today, so that you're going to work harder at it and do it tomorrow. You can get smarter.
Jeff,
Am I back?
I think, yeah, you just froze up.
Yeah, no, I did. It told me I froze up. So,
great.
Okay, so sorry about that, everybody. There we go. I'm back. Where did I stop, Anna? I was talking about growth mindsets versus fixed mindsets. And the important thing is to know that if you have a growth mindset, you know that you can improve. Intelligence is not that different than our abilities at sports. For example, if you start golf, you're not going to do well, and you're not going to expect to do well, and you know you have to practice. And if you hire a coach, you know that the coach can't make you better. He can tell you what you're doing wrong, but you still have to practice. Well, I want you to think of your professors as your coaches or your personal trainers. You cannot get smarter without putting some work in. You can't just come into class and have me insert the material into your brain. You're going to have to put the work in there. But you can get better at chemistry. You can get better at golf. So once you know yourself, you're on the road to metacognition. Metacognition, we sometimes talk about as thinking about thinking. It's really knowing ourselves and knowing not only what we know, but how we learn and how we can learn more. We evaluate our strengths and weaknesses, and then we make plans. Once we make our plans, we try to apply the strategies. After we've done some work, we reflect upon that work. We look at what was successful and what wasn't successful. And this is a cycle because we use that to learn about how we can do better the next time we have a task. So metacognition is very important. It's very important to understand your strengths and your weaknesses. It's important to understand where you have gone wrong so that you can fix it. It's important to be able to plan and try to implement those plans and learn and reflect and learn from those planning strategies. So as I said, there's metacognition, but we also need to learn how to learn. So what I show here are just 3 different books that I've read over the last year or so about learning. Most of them talk about similar things, but I have to admit that I found it very intriguing. Sorry, I'm getting a laser pointer. So this book is a very good book, but I would say these 2 books are similar. The New Science of Learning is very accessible to students. One of the nice things about the New Science of Learning, it gets into some other aspects like the things that Dr. Follis talked about when he was here, and that is the importance of good nutrition and sleep and physical activity. All of these things can help you learn better. A healthy body leads to a healthy mind. These other 2 books talk about different strategies you can use to learn better. And what I like about them is most of them also talk about the fact that learning is not easy, that learning requires some work. So one of the things I think most of you have probably heard about is don't memorize. Yet we've all memorized, well, actually, I don't know if we do this anymore. When I was a student, we had to memorize our multiplication tables. Most people memorize the multiplication table. When I was in school, I was taught to do it from 1 to 10 to our hundreds. I expanded that to 144. Now we can always figure things out, and lately what we hear a lot is don't memorize, but I actually have changed that because I think memorizing can be very important. What I like to stress is don't just memorize. For example, if you didn't memorize the times tables, you have to figure out what 6 times 5 is every time. If you memorize the time tables, you just have that piece of data at your grasp, 30, you know it. And you don't have to waste a lot of time figuring it out. The same is true in chemistry. If you remember things like carbon has 4 bonds, and if carbon has less than 4 bonds, it's reactive, then there's something wrong. I know I may be talking about things you don't know yet, but if you memorize those things, you have them at your grasp immediately. But you also have to understand them, and that's how you better memorize things. When you understand material, you're more likely to remember it. Students who study for understanding, they read and think critically about the material. You ask question why a lot. Why is this way? And when you can figure out why it is that way, then you start to remember. You start to recognize the complexity of the content. And you can see the relationships between different concepts. The next thing I want to talk a little bit is about learning styles. Now, I've heard a lot about learning styles lately, and I've read a lot about them, and now most cognitive psychologists talk about this as being a neuromyth, that we don't actually have learning styles. We may be better at one learning style than another. For instance, we may be better learning things visually than through a textual basis, but in fact, the content we're trying to learn probably determines the best method of figuring it out. For example, try to study geography without looking at pictures of countries and maps. You couldn't learn it just by reading words. You need to see the countries that you're learning. Chemistry is a very visual science. We learn a lot through graphs and structures and both 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional structures of molecules. So we need to use all of our different senses to learn. So it's been modified now, and we talk about multisensory or active learning. Sometimes you'll hear about the theory of multiple intelligence. And what this is telling us is that we have many different ways to learn. And in fact, the best way to learn is to use several of these modes at once, multisensory learning. What I found through my reading is that this is probably not completely accurate, but what we find when we look into the learning literature is that people will remember things they read, but just minimally. And people try to read things multiple times, but we'll remember about 10% of what we read. We'll learn a little bit more about what we hear, but if we see and hear it, we can learn a little bit more. In fact, seeing and hearing is quite effective at learning. We actually start remembering more and more. But when we start to do things, when we start creating learning, when we start writing, we remember a lot more of the things we've written and the things that we do. So we talk about that as being active learning. And active learning is a very good way to learn. So I want to talk a little bit about how we can better learn things. For example, I see a lot of students now take notes with their computers. There's been a lot of studies on this lately, and very few students actually take notes by hand anymore. But they did some experiments, and what they found was that for students that took notes, they were actually to get what the teacher was saying almost verbatim. They could almost make a perfect transcript of what the teacher was saying, but they didn't. There was no retention of that when they were tested on it later. They didn't learn that material. When they took notes by hand with a pen and paper, they only got about 60 to 70% of the material. But what happens when you take notes by hand is you have to listen, and then you have to synthesize that information in your head and paraphrase it, because you can't keep up. You can't write what the teacher is saying verbatim. So you have to put it inside your brain, convert it to something you can write down. And doing the exercise of doing that actually will embed the information a little bit better, and you'll retain things better. And they did find that students that took notes by hand were much better on their assessments, on writing the tests and exams later on. So what we see in the classroom a lot now is that we do a lot of our teaching using PowerPoint, and we eventually give the students, most of us will eventually give the students the PowerPoint notes, and many people give the PowerPoint notes beforehand. So students come to class and they watch the PowerPoint, they may follow along on their computers, but they're not taking notes by hand. And I think this is hurting a lot of students. Some students will take notes on a laptop, but again, it's not nearly as effective as a learning tool as taking notes by hand, drawing little diagrams, trying to reproduce what your instructor is doing on the board. If they happen to be drawing graphs, you draw the graphs, you start to understand the graphs. So it's very important to try and convince yourself that you should be taking notes by hand rather than just looking at the notes on the slides and maybe perhaps getting those slides and using them to study. So you should be doing more than just looking at PowerPoint notes. Another way I like to talk about converting passive learning to active learning in the classroom. So if we go to a class lecture, the most passive thing you can do is just watch and listen. Just sit there and listen to your professor. And as a matter of fact, you'll sit there and listen to your professor, and you may think that she's making a lot of sense and that you're learning this material because she's up there talking about it and you understand it while she's talking about it. Some people may type notes. That's being minimally active. But the people who will do the best are the people who are sitting there, they're taking notes, they're deciding what is important, paraphrasing it, and then writing it down by hand. As they're doing that, they'll come up with questions. They may say, I didn't quite understand that. Hopefully, their hand pops up and they ask those questions. One of the things I can tell you is that very rarely will your professors or your instructors ask you not to ask questions. In fact, I'm often trying to get my students to ask questions. I have a lot of students who will come up to me after the class and ask me a question, and I always say that would have been nice to ask in class, because I'm sure that of the 30 people sitting in that room, more than just you had that question. So if you have a question, pop your hand up and ask it. If the questions get to be too much, your instructor will ask you to wait. But for the most part, I think most instructors actually like questions. Sit there and try to connect the ideas. When you go from one concept to the next, think about whether there's connections between that. Another thing that's important is reading. So some people will just read. Other people will read and highlight, and they may read and reread. But when you're doing a reading assignment, what you should probably do is make outlines and study sheets, look for trends and patterns, try to find some questions and write them down so that you can ask your instructor or your friends when next time you see them. If you're studying for exam, lots of people will read texts and notes, read the textbook, and if they take notes, reread their notes. Other people will practice rewriting their notes, so that's being minimally active. But if you do practice tests, make flashcards, use their flashcards with a friend, present problems to a friend, and try and work out those problems together. Teach a friend that is not in the class. That's a very effective way to learn, is when you teach someone who has a little bit less knowledge than you do. You have to be careful. You don't want to, if you're taking a third year course in physical chemistry, you probably don't want to try and teach that to your grandparents, although that is a good exercise to try and synthesize it down to something they can understand. But try and teach it to someone who's in second year chemistry, who's in the course that is the prerequisite for the one you're taking. See if you can convey those examples to those people. That helps you learn. Another thing that's important is to understand the illusion of knowing. As I mentioned, a lot of times students will be sitting in the classroom and they're listening to their professor and they're understanding everything she says. So that's the illusion of confidence. I'm sitting there and I understand what my professor's saying, but you have to be able to understand and reproduce that without your professor. That's true knowing, and that's not the illusion of confidence. There's also the illusion of repetition, where if I just read and reread, I feel like I know it because I just read it and I remember it, so I think I know it, but a couple days later you may not know it as well. There's the illusion of simplicity. Something seems rather simple. Be careful, it may be more complex than you know. There's one more thing that we talk about, the illusion of difficulty. That's slightly different. That's also something that's a bit of a consequence of a fixed mindset, where we feel something so difficult that we can never learn it. Again, you have to remember that just because you don't know it now doesn't mean that you can't learn it for tomorrow. Psychologists have figured something out, something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. As it turns out, the psychologists were Dunning and Kruger that first did some experiments and reported on this, but what they found is that quite often people who know nothing about a subject and are introduced to it, they often have a high confidence that they know this material well. This is called the Dunning-Kruger effect, when people are not really very competent in something, but they feel that they know it a lot. And what happens as you begin to learn, you start to realize that you don't know it as well as you thought you would, and you get to this period where you're feeling this is kind of tough. But as you gain more and more competence in the subject, you start to regain your confidence and start to figure it out. And I think this is an important question to ask yourself. Was it easy? Maybe, but probably not. When you're learning new stuff, it probably wasn't as easy as you first thought. So it's important not to let yourself get tied up with the illusion of knowing. You need to figure out whether you really know something or not. And you can do that by asking your professor for some old tests and give a try for the tests. Don't look at the solutions until after you've tried to do the problems on your own. If you're doing the problem by looking at the solutions, you're probably not learning, you're just copying. You need to figure it out, and you need to get it wrong so that you can learn from that. You need to try some problems, get them wrong, look at the solutions then, and figure out where you went wrong. That's how you embed the information in your head. The next thing I want to talk about is the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. So Hermann Ebbinghaus, back in the late 1800s, did some experiments, and he found that when people try to learn material, they forget it rather quickly. So if you learn something new on the day that you learn it, very quickly, after about one day, this is probably not real data. It looks much too smooth. I would think that the actual forgetting curve would be much more lumpy than this would be. But most people lose 50% or more of that material that they learned about just the day before. So you can learn some material, and after the first day, you've forgotten half of it. After about the 5th or 6th day, you've forgotten most of it. You're down below 20% of retention of that material. So that stuff you learned in the first week of class, if you have not looked at it again before the midterm, you're not going to be very fresh with it. You're not going to know it so well. So there's something that we can do to fix this. And I like this next graph because this is right out of my introductory class for my organic chemistry exam. We're talking about something called distributed practice or spaced review. A lot of students go to class and they don't pick up their textbook until the night before the exam, and then they try to cram. And we try cramming because we're actually trying to cram all that information into our brains with a plunger. We're just trying to learn it all at once. That's not how we learn. So I like to talk about, we look at the material And then after a day or so, we look at it again and we relearn it. And then we start forgetting slower, okay? And every time we revisit it, we embed a little bit more information into our brains. And after we've revisited it another time, you see that we begin to retain that material. We don't forget it nearly as much, and we begin to have true knowledge. So I like this graph because what I talk about here is for the students that reads the material before class so that they know what's coming up. They get in class, they take notes, they review, they do extra problems, they go to the tutorials. That's most of my A students. Those are the students that are working at learning. They're realizing that they can improve their intelligence in the area of organic chemistry. The students that just do the preview, they read the material before class, and then they come to class and then they do the homework. That'll be your B students typically, because they're pretty high up on the forgetting curve as well. That's perfectly legitimate way. And oftentimes we're taking a course, which we're taking it because we're interested in it. We don't want to get too involved in it because it's not required. It's an elective, but we want to learn something about it. And often students are quite happy to get a B in their elective. The C student is the student who comes to class and doesn't do much else other than they may do their homework, but they don't study, they don't preview, and they cram the night before midterms and exams. Those are students that are likely to get to a C. And if you're a student that just comes to class, you're going to be in the danger zone. So I like this graph along with these notes because it lets students know that if you want to get this A, you have to put some work into it. And you have to be mindful and thoughtful of how you do that work. You don't just read and reread. That's not studying, that's reading and rereading. You won't remember it. You're just going to get the illusion of knowing the material rather than actually knowing the material. So this is my final slide. And again, this is a slide I use for my class in organic chemistry. And I tell students that if you want that A, you need to do some work before you come to class. You need to read the textbook. Read the material that your professor is going to talk about tomorrow. Don't read it after he's talked about it. You want to read the material beforehand so you can find out where you may have problems and you can ask questions. You can be ready. So you familiarize yourself with the things that he's going to be talking about tomorrow. Maybe you generate some outlines. You need to know where trouble lurks, where there are concepts that you don't understand. Then write down the questions and be ready to ask them. Once you're in class, as much as possible, try to be engaged. If you know the material, you know it's coming up, that will help you with taking notes as well, because you're going to see it coming and maybe you get a little bit better establishment of that concept and you can take a better note. And again, if the professor draws a diagram up there and talks about it, you should draw that diagram and make notes beside the diagram. Learn all those things, ask questions, have those questions prepared, and try and think of new questions as well. If you have trouble, make sure that you note that you have trouble, and then you afterwards can go out and fix those problems that you're having. So after the class, you need to reinforce learning, review notes, find some answers, do all the homework and the problems. If you want that A, you're going to have to do some extra work, practice those diagram structures and mechanisms. Discuss the material with your classmates, form a study group, and try and teach it. So that's pretty well all that I wanted to talk about today. So I'm going to ask Mary if she can go ahead and share her content. Sorry, my mouse, there we go, got my mouse back.
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. All right, so like Jeff said, my name is Mary Sweatman, and I teach in the Department of Community Development. And we have all been sitting for an hour. So I want everyone just to stand up and stretch, do a little stretch, move around a little bit. And I think that's important for studying too, is that we can't always just be sitting for long periods of time. So don't be afraid to do that. And as actually I was listening to Jeff and Anna speak, you know, some of the classes that you're going to be taking are online. And so I really encourage you to set up a really good study space. And that might look like your computer up higher on a stand-up desk so that you can be standing up some of the time and moving around. And actually, we can retain more information if we're not just staying stagnant for long periods of time. So that's just a side note that doesn't have much to do with what I'm talking about. But just to remember to move, because we're all going to be on the computer a lot this semester in particular. So thank you for having me, and thank you for joining and taking the time to be part of this this session. I'm going to talk about community, collaboration, and accountability. And you might be thinking, what does that have to do with studying? And so I'm going to make the link to what I talk a lot about in class, and that if we study together and we work together, we'll do better. That we thrive in our communities when we can put multiple heads together and multiple skills and assets and gifts that we all have. So yeah, that's what I'm going to be talking about. I want to see if I can advance the slide here. First, I want to talk about the study group and what that could mean. There are usually two reasons why you would be in a study group, and one, it's because it works for you. You think you have, you see that there's an opportunity here within some classmates or within people that have like-minded goals, and you get together and study together. And the other reason why you might form a study group is because you have to. So your professor has told you have to do a big project in groups, and maybe you select the people or maybe you don't, but you need to work together on a project. And I'm pretty sure that in all of our faculties, professional studies, the arts and sciences, you will be in a group at some point in your time here, and you'll have to work together. So it is valuable to think about studying in groups and working in groups. I want to tell a couple stories about my experiences working in groups. The first one was I actually did my undergrad here at Acadia as well in recreation management. And a group of students that I was really close with, we decided to, it wasn't necessarily because of a study group at first, it was more we wanted to test out the idea of free school and to teach each other skills. And so we would get together once a week for about an hour, and we would teach each other something new. So, for example, I taught the group how to knit. Another friend of mine taught the group how to make bread. But eventually what happened was that we morphed into a really productive studying group, because we would help each other out with what was going on in our different classes, and we were in a lot of similar classes. And so we would end up talking about the classes and talking about how to be successful. And then we eventually would say, okay, well, instead of doing a skill share, let's study for this midterm that's coming up, or let's work on this assignment for the hour. And one of the things I remember was really helpful was I had a friend, Gabby, who remembered everything. And so sometimes when I would say, you know, okay, I'm working on this essay in this poli-sci class and I'm really hoping to get an A, and I, you know, say the due date, and just by saying it out loud actually was really helpful for me to tell a group of friends. It held me accountable. But then my friend Gabby, who was amazing, she would say, you know, a week later, how is that A+ paper going? And so she would set the bar a little bit higher and push me a little bit more and hold me accountable. And so I think that's one of the benefits of this study, this idea of studying together in group, is that we can help each other, hold each other accountable, and be together, be supportive in a community. So I'd really encourage you, you know, in the first couple weeks of classes to look around the room and say, who is it that I could work with, and who would be good to connect with, to work with. And then, of course, is that other one that I was talking about, where you're going to maybe be put in a group of people, or you're going to have to pick a group of people to actually work on an assignment with. And that is challenging. Jeff, my connection just said there's a bad network. Can you still hear me? Yeah?
I can, Mary, yeah.
Great. So then it's also figuring out how to work together in a group, if you were put into that group. So that's what I want to talk about next, is effectively studying together. So whether you're in person or you're online, whether you're in a group that you have picked or whether you've been put in a group, and how do you do that? So how many? If you have a choice, it's really effective to work in groups of 4 to 6, to not go beyond that group of 6, and to keep it into a small group. 4 is probably the ideal number, but as small as 2 also works if you have a peer that you can really work with and check in on each other with. But let's say a group of 4 to 6 is the ideal, who you would want to have similar goals. So you can sometimes select someone in your course or identify who might have similar goals by the way they participate in the class. And also you might just have to ask. So in that first couple interactions with them, especially if you're online, you might not have the same opportunities, but maybe in small discussion groups, you can put it out there, like, I want to start a study group. Would anybody be interested? I'm interested in, my goal is to get an A in this course. And I would, if that aligns with your goal, let me know. So having those shared goals. It can also be helpful to select group members with unique talents and knowledge. So try not to always think of that everyone should be exactly the same in your study group. That is actually really beneficial to have diversity within your study group and having people who have diverse backgrounds and unique ways of looking at things, because if we have multiple ways of knowing, we can dig even deeper into a subject. Where do you want to study? So my advice is that you need to think about the environment. Limit distractions, be in a place where you're not going to be talked at or talked to by other groups outside of your study group. So being in a busy hall or a busy residence might not be the best place, but using the library is a good spot. I know it's going to be hard this semester with what is available to you. A quiet picnic table when the weather is still nice would be great. And if you're online, that's an ideal space because no one can interrupt you. And just as a note for that is that a few of my colleagues in community development and I, over the past 2 weeks, we've gotten together in the morning . Did I disappear?
You did, Mary. You said we got together in the morning and then you disappeared.
Okay. We would get together in the morning and then we disappear, literally. And then we would go off and do our work, and then we would come back together around 3 o'clock and check in and say, how did you do? Did you meet your goals? And it was really productive. I got so much done those days because I was excited to hear what they did, and I was excited to tell them what I did around my course development. So I'm going to try to share my my slide. Can you see my slides? Oh, you can. Interesting. I cannot. So we'll try to get back in there. Hold on. There we go. What's interesting is I'm on campus. And I came into campus so I would have a good connection, because for those that know this area, I live in the Gaspereau Valley, which doesn't always have great connections. Anywho, how long? So this is an important one too, is that sometimes we feel like we need to marathon study, and that is actually not very effective. So setting a time of 2 hours, 2 to 3 hours, try not to go beyond that. And if you're going beyond that, stop and take breaks. Go for a little walk around a block, or go somewhere and grab something to drink, or have something that you can stop and get back into it. But 2 to 3 hours is probably the amount of time you want to dedicate to the study group with those breaks. And then when I would really recommend to be consistent. So if you're going to have this formal study group, that you say we're going to meet once a week, and it's going to be on Thursdays at 7 o'clock, or whenever that group can get together, and put it in your calendar and be dedicated to it. Treat it like a course. Say, I'm going to go to this every time. We have a study group in community development, actually, and they meet every Mondays. It's run through our student society, so faculty really aren't doing anything with it at all, but our students They get together, it's usually Monday evenings, and the people that go are really consistent about going, and they do really well in their courses. And what's great is that it's first years, second years, third years, fourth years, and beyond, and so that they can really help each other with courses that they've been in, recommend courses to take next time. So those are all, being consistent and having that group means that they know that it's going to happen. And they can rely on that group, which is great. And then how to start. So this semester is going to be a little bit more different if you have most of your classes virtually, around how to get started and how to form that group. And I have some recommendations for that near the end. But really, when you start, one of the first things you want to do is, see if I can get to take some time. I think this is really important, to talk about who's in the group and the personalities that you're working with. So for example, are there some extroverts or introverts in the group, and how does that impact how you communicate with each other? So if you identify as an extrovert, you might want to say, and you can say, okay, well, I enjoy talking. When I have an idea, I want to put it out there and get instant feedback. Where you might recognize that someone in your group is an introvert, and they might not be as willing to share what they're thinking until they've really thought through it. And if you're aware of each other's introverted or extroverted tendencies, then you'll be more likely to be sensitive towards that. So you might be, if you're the extrovert, you might say, hey, I might not talk as much of this study group, and I might ask more questions to engage some of the introverts in that conversation. This is Myers-Briggs personality test that I have up here, but another personality that I think is really important to be aware of when it comes to studying together are the J and the P here. It says judgers and perceivers. And judgers, and it's not negative or positive to be either of these things. It's just the names that they've been given. But judgers tend to be organized and prepared, where perceivers are more spontaneous, and they like to not be tied down to a real routine. And so if you have some judgers and perceivers in a group, they're going to act very differently, because your judgers will want to be organized and prepared, and they'll have the readings done. They'll have it in their agenda when everything is due, where the perceivers might come to the meeting without their readings done, but they'll want to talk about it, and they'll might engage in different ways. And I often, if you don't know what you are, most people are like, oh yeah, I'm this or I'm that. But I do this with my students in my first year class, is I get them to think about what their closet looks like. And if your closet is super organized and you have everything folded and your laundry is done and it looks great, your socks are all paired up, then you probably are a J, which means that you tend to be more organized and prepared, and you like to stick to the plan. So when you're getting to your 8:30 class, you fold your clothes in your pajamas before you get to your 8:30. You've had breakfast, you're all ready to go. Where perceivers, if you are more likely to have a kind of chaotic, potentially closet, maybe clothes all over the place.
Study skills, and today we're going to look at how to take great notes.
Oh, I hear something. Is that my computer?
No, I think Jeff was unmuted.
Okay. So the perceivers would have the messier closet. But what's great about having the J's and the P's in a study group together is that you have the J's who are going to be really organized and keep you task focused, but then you'll have the perceivers that are open to exploring different opportunities, or saying, let's take this avenue, or I wonder what the professor meant about this. Let's go and explore this author that they might have mentioned, or kind of take the group down a different path. And the judges need to be open to that opportunity, but can also pull the group back to say, you know what, we do have an essay due at the end of next week, so we should probably make sure at the end of this study session we have our outline done. So none of these personality types are better or worse than the other one, but it's important to know who you are. And actually, our counseling department at Acadia University provides this test for students if anyone wants to actually do the Myers-Briggs test. And in my first year class, we also do this test, so that at the end of my first year class, people know where they are, and it's helpful. It's not perfect. It's certainly not a perfect personality test, but it helps us understand how we might interact with others, and how we can work in groups better, and how we can lead groups better in our communities of learners. So moving on, The next big thing that you want to do when you're starting your study group is to think about your goals. I often use this idea of SMART. So be specific about your goals, make sure they're measurable. When do we know we've been successful? They're achievable, realistic, and timely. And so when you think about your group, you might want to say, okay, we're going to set this goal of trying to get an A on our presentation and the paper that we have to submit for this project. And then you work backwards from that and say, okay, if we want to get an A, going back to Jeff's slides around, well, that means we go to class, we do our readings, we're going to do an outline. Maybe the professor has said that if you hand in something a week before, they'll have a look at it, or maybe a TA is in the class, a teaching assistant, and they'll have a look at it before. So maybe we'll try to get the assignment done 2 weeks before the due date or a week before the due date and get some feedback on it. So trying to work backwards from the goal or the due date of the assignment. But it's always good to set goals. And if your group, your study group doesn't necessarily have to have the same goals individually, but if you are, so for example, my goal might be to get a B+ in the class where someone else's is an A+. But if we both set those intentions and tell each other, then we can hold each other accountable for those goals, which is also important. So I just have a couple more slides more about the other resources on campus and how to be a community or how to engage in the community. So when you're in your study group, it might be, you might want to also take advantage of faculty office hours. And I think, you know, sometimes we see faculty office hours, and I remember as a student being like, does that mean that the faculty is busy because they're sitting in their office, you know, doing their thing? But when you read faculty office hours on your syllabus, it means that they're there sitting there either online or in person. This semester it'll be online, ready to serve you or ready to meet with you. So take advantage of those hours. I always thought they should be called student hours as a side note. Anyway, the other one to take advantage of is teaching assistants hours. Sometimes they set hours that you can meet them and talk with them. Teaching assistants have usually taken the course. They are sometimes teaching assistants for multiple courses, and they have a wealth of knowledge to share with you. Take advantage of departmental or subject-related study groups or help centers. So like I mentioned, our department has a study group, so going to that, getting to know those folks in that group. And then on Acadia websites, you can see lots of different subject-related study groups that you can join and help centers. We have a great writing center that has tutoring sessions that you can sign up for. There are tutoring services that you can pay for at Acadia, but there's also free ones related to subject matter. And if you go to that website, you can click on the subject matter and find out about free tutoring. We have accessibility services. And so if you are having trouble in any of your courses with some of the material or with access, there are lots of accommodations that we can provide through accessibility services given stipulations. So it's worth checking out if you are struggling with some of your classes, and that's part of your community. It's part of the extracurriculars that you do to be successful here at Acadia. And then there's also student-specific resources. So for example, the Indigenous Students Resource Center that you can go and take advantage of as well as Indigenous students. Finally, we've had some questions during these study sessions or these sessions that Jeff and Anna have been putting together around how to make friends virtually. And so how do you make a study group, or how do you make friends virtually this semester? And I admit it is going to be different, and it's going to be a little bit more challenging. But some of the things that you can do is to be an engaged participant in your class. So really, you know, when the teacher asks for people to speak up or to discuss, or your peer in your class has said something, then I would encourage you to add to that note or to make it clear that you support them. Participate in the chat boxes, so be an active participant. And people will recognize that and potentially reach out to you, or you do the same, or you see someone who might have some similar goals or ideas as you do. Don't be afraid to reach out to them after class, or stick around online after class is done and talk to a professor about saying, I want to start a study group. Perhaps the professor can help you connect with some people. Join your department social media site. So most departments have a Facebook or an Instagram or a Twitter account. I would really recommend joining that. It's a great way to connect with faculty, but also other students. Participate in Acadia online events. There's going to be lots this year through the ASU, the student union, but also through departments. So really encourage you to, I know it's going to be hard because you're going to be online a lot, but there are other opportunities to be online to engage socially. So that would be another way. And join a club that speaks to your interests. So there's tons of clubs to join, and they're all working hard at trying to figure out how to be virtual this semester and how to have club extravaganza virtually so that you can find out about the clubs. So just stay tuned to what's happening at the ASU. And like the study groups, if you join group clubs or groups that speak to your interests, you're going to meet people that have those similar interests. And then from there, you can also form study groups or form ways of working together. And then I also would recommend invite someone on a virtual coffee date. This, this might seem kind of silly, but I've been trying to do it once in a while, and it's, you say, let's just hang out online for an hour and catch up with someone that you haven't seen for a while, or when there is someone in class that, a peer that you hear has a really interesting idea and you want to know more, don't be afraid to reach out and just say, do you want to chat more about this idea? And to be bold and brave and try to meet friends virtually. And hopefully by the winter we'll have more opportunities to be in person. But until then, try to find these avenues to meet people, make study groups, and make friends. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful. Please put any questions that you might have about anything that I talked about in the chat, and I can address it after. But for now, I will pass it over to Jamie. So I will end my sharing.
Thank you. Jeff, can I go ahead and share? Okay.
Please do, Jamie.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Welcome. As I get this up and running here, one of the sort of commonalities to what we've been talking about today has to do with balance. Can you guys see that now? I can't hear anyone.
Yeah,
Yes, we can.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so we've been talking about balance, and I think Jeff in particular pointed out how sometimes it's part of your process. Sort of sometimes you need those windows of time where you're not doing anything, or you're not doing anything related to work, and that might be when something comes to you. And I was mindful of this last night because this presentation, basically the details of it, came to me when just after I put my daughter to bed. She's 2. She likes me to hang out in her room, which is a very relaxing place to hang out in, like a rocking chair. And she likes you to stick around for a couple minutes. She says few minutes. So I do. And usually that's where I start doing a lot of thinking about stuff. And so I basically was in this balance of trying to make sure my daughter got to sleep, but also wanting to rush out of the room to get a piece of paper to write down what I'm about to talk about. So anyway, sometimes you need those times where your brain is sort of shut off. Sometimes for some people it's in the shower, driving, or walking, whatever it is. But you need those times to sort of let your brain process stuff. And so balance in general is a really effective way of dealing with life, but also being a university student. The other story I'd start off with here is start with a sort of contradiction that I always found in my own life as a university student, where I wish I was for a long time. I went to Acadia, I went to New Zealand for a couple of years to do my master's. I did my PhD in Vancouver. And so that's like over a decade of school. And everywhere I went, I found I had this very distinct contradiction in my life, which was essentially like 2 terms, 2 periods of the year. And one was my most productive and one was my least productive, but it didn't make sense. The productive one didn't make sense to me initially. The backstory of that is the productive term was actually when I played really competitive rugby, either varsity or high-level clubs. And, you know, in the season, I would have hours and hours every week of practice. And somehow that would often be a busy term for my course schedule for whatever reason, but I was always able to get more done. And then the second term, or the second half of the year, when you take rugby away, I would have these huge voids in my schedule, but somehow I would always feel like I was rushing and busier and ultimately not as productive. And so over time, I probably should have learned this quicker, but I realized that structure, that routine, that balance was part of what was helping me become a successful student. So we start today with that story with this sort of central contradiction that I was always most productive in my busiest times, but I always felt busiest in my non-busy times. So from that, this is not earth-shattering, but from that I derived this sort of lesson, which is pretty basic: structure plus routine plus balance equals successful time management. And I'd love to sit here and tell you all about that and say that's your secret. And hopefully that will be a secret for subsequent years at Acadia. And so, you know, I put this list of stuff you would do in normal time. I'm going to go a little quick because I want to make sure we have time for questions at the end. But in normal times, I would say, especially for students that come in person to campus, to really deeply integrate yourself into community. Right? Be yourself, maintain your extracurriculars, find new interests, build social networks and other kinds of networks, contribute to campus and community, volunteer work, fun, all those different things. Just get out there. And I think you would find, as long as school is part of that focus, what you would find is you would be very productive while being very busy. And I think that's a real advantage to what we have at schools like Acadia, small universities, small towns. You can get deeply interwoven in stuff and succeed. Of course, this brings us to the dilemma we have this year. And that's one of the things I want to focus on this year to help you going forward, is that it is harder, or we have to maintain that balance in a different way, right? So life and learning and COVID-19 means nothing is normal. Some of you may have no scheduled classes. I know I'm not teaching any scheduled classes, for instance. All my courses are virtual, unscheduled. Some of you might have those. Some will have different versions of classes. Some will even have face-to-face. But when you're facing this term, particularly this term, and who knows how long, you might want to think longer term than that too, it's figuring out ways to create that routine, create that structure in a potentially unstructured universe, right? So just as a sort of mental, one of the things I recommend doing, I know Dr. Kiefte mentioned this too, there's different kinds of calendar softwares out there that you can use. Some people prefer hard copies, like an actual calendar on the wall or a book or a notebook, whatever it is, but make a calendar. And as Dr. Kiefte also pointed out, make one that considers the term and the big assignments and things like that, but also one that might involve daily lists or at least weekly. And I've chosen to just focus on a pretend week, just to give you some idea of my central point here in our universe now, in the pandemic times. The onus is on you, particularly for those of us who are suddenly very unstructured, is to manufacture that structure. Because without it, it is very easy to get lost and not do a lot of work, and then get behind in the vicious cycle. I mean, frankly, that's easy. That happens to a lot of students every year anyway. As soon as they, especially first-year students, away from home for the first time, away from the structure, perhaps of high school and other things. But especially this year, that's going to be hard because some of the things you typically would have scheduled in your day might not be scheduled, including classes. So you want to manufacture a structure, but it has to be realistic. You want to set up a realistic, sustainable pattern of routine and in existence that includes work, schoolwork, if you have other jobs or volunteer, community engagements, whatever, it includes those, it includes extracurriculars, but it's going to take a little bit more work and a little bit more intentionality to actually do that in a time when almost all of those things will be a little different than what you're used to, right? I mean, maybe we're getting used to it now a few months in, but so to give you just a very brief snapshot of what that might look like without taking us too far along in time, you might arrive at a weekly schedule that looks like this. Right? These are this is an imaginary thing, but these are two history courses. This is your history course, your one history course that actually is live and scheduled, and that's your week. And I will tell you, if you look at your week as that, and you might have this long, beautiful list of all the other stuff you do, but if you don't start putting those lists into these blocks, this calendar, you're not going to get it done. Because it's going to be very easy to get in a routine of whatever it is, sleeping in or, you know, just wandering, not aimlessly, like watching Netflix until Netflix checks in with you and says, like, are you still there? Are you sure you want to keep doing this? So the trick is then, how do we fill that up? And again, I'm just using sort of like some rough outlines here, but just to give you some sense of what one might do. Okay, so you start with what's scheduled. Okay, in this case, this is a pretty extreme version of a very unscheduled week, right? So we plop that in there. I'm not going to put up on the calendar, but there are certain things that are just sort of assumed you should be doing, but unfortunately we don't always do as well. Eat well, sleep, wash your hands. That takes a lot of time nowadays. Do those things. I'm not going to put that on the calendar, but think about when those times are going to be, and then some of the other stuff. So try to actually earmark some times for course prep, whether that be groups like Dr. Sweetman, which is very weird for me to say because Mary and I went to Acadia together. But anyway, as Dr. Sweetman says, it might be group prep, it might be other kinds of course prep, but make time for that. Another thing you'll notice is in this particular calendar, I've chosen to color code. I personally find that very helpful to kind of think of those blocks, and then that helps me distinguish them. Make sure you build in your unscheduled classes. So in this particular, I guess I picked an art student because that's what I am. You know, you might have a couple courses or several other courses that are unscheduled and virtual. You should schedule them in your brain, in a time, in your calendar, in a place that makes sense. So in this particular case, I worked under the assumption of having a nice daily routine of, you know, you wake up, you have your breakfast, whatever, but as of 9 o'clock, you're doing coursework, or sorry, you're doing like classes basically. But you can do other things. In this particular case, there's a film history course that might have a movie as part of its sort of weekly assignment. So that fit nicely in an evening. So it's kind of like a break, but also something, an active learning break. So figure out what courses you have that are not scheduled, and the activities that they are asking you to do. And then the course prep purple ones that I put up there, that's for the stuff, like figuring out what expectations for course prep in terms of reading or whatever pre-class preparations are suggested, or weekly preparations. Do it in those sort of pink, purple, whatever color you want to call that. I'm always mindful of that because I had a student who was colorblind and didn't tell me till midway through the term. So there's a whole bunch of my PowerPoints that he just wasn't getting. And then that was a very easy fix for me to do. So I don't know what color you are seeing, but these are the colors that I am seeing. And then you build in times. This is a bad example. If you are colorblind, these are red. You might not actually see anything here. But assignment time. This is when you actually make sure you book out time, and you might have to expand this. And sometimes with the term, it'll be bigger and less and smaller. But times when you're actually sitting down working on an assignment, like an assessment that is due at in some capacity, or it might be, you know, studying for a test or whatever it is. But make sure you figure out how much time you probably should do for that, and then book it in. But then, because, you know, as we've talked about in different ways, as being whole people, as having a balance in life, knowing yourself. You got to find the things that can help you relax and do them. Now, the person that studied in Vancouver is really coming out of me here. So you might want to add in some time for some yoga in the morning. If you do yoga, go for walks. On Saturday, you might want to earmark a big chunk of time to do something that you like doing, like a canoe, a hike, but it could be obviously anything like that. Some of you might be training for, marathons, half marathons, whatever, and you need a time where you actually have to go do a long run, not just a shorter run that you could fit in other times. Whatever it is, do something that feels good for your body, and that will be good for your mind and keeping track of your schedule. It also, of course, given my personal history, if you're used to being on a structured sports team, for instance, and that sports team is not going to exist, find a replacement. Trust me. If you're used to doing stuff like a team sport and you stop doing team sports, it actually can be a really difficult transition to not have that accountability. So try to find some way of simulating teamwork or team activity or accountability, because it's a lot harder to go for a run when if you're used to doing that only so you can be in shape to support your teammates. If you like to go on runs because you're good at pushing yourself to get a faster and faster time, then you will enjoy running. But if you're only ever doing that to help your teammates, and then you don't have teammates anymore, then you stop running, or whatever it is. And then finally, of course, and this depends dramatically on the individual students, but you might have work commitments, employment commitments, volunteer commitments, other things like that. So whatever it is, build stuff into your schedule. I'm stopping at this point. You'll see there are spots in the schedule left. I did that on purpose for two reasons. One, you should have spots that you don't have anything to do. As I started this presentation about, like sometimes you need to be sitting in the dark room somewhere or knitting or doing something that helps your brain do other things, like just sort of wander off and help. That will help you in a lot of different levels. But also, I appreciate there's a whole whack of things that you're all individual people with all very different skills and interests and whatever. And I basically chose this to reflect kind of who I am. But obviously, you might have other kinds of commitments in there. Like, for instance, I didn't include on this for myself, but like family commitments, picking kids up from school, helping them get to bed, whatever it is. Maybe you like cooking. Maybe there's particular office hours that your professors have. You want to book in so you can be available for that. Maybe you like playing video games. Maybe you have meetings. Whatever it is. So I've left blocks here because you should have some blocks open if you can, but also it's going to depend on the week. It's going to depend on the person. But basically, especially in this sort of unhinged, unsettled time, it's going to be incumbent on all of us to try to build that structure. So put those building blocks in place for success. Anyway, I'll stop there and do my best to stop sharing. We welcome your questions. I think Jeff is going to handle that. Thank you.
Jeff, you're muted.
Thank you, JB, and thank you, Mary, and thank you, Anna. It's funny how you're muted when you want to talk and you're not muted when you're pulling up YouTube videos. I want to apologize to Mary for looking for those YouTube videos I was trying to put to answer some of the student questions. Do we have any more questions, folks? Please feel free to put them on the side in the question and answer area, and we'll wait around for just a second to see if any questions pop up.
Maybe we can go through the ones that were already posted, Jeff, and just talk through them as well.
Okay, so Evelyn asks, will there be an opportunity for me to discover clubs if I'm coming to campus second semester? I see that Anna answered that. We usually have a Meet the Professor session at the Student Union building, but as Anna mentions, we won't be able to do that this year. I suspect there will be something. I'll try and find out about that. I'll talk to James Hanford and find out if there's anything. And then I'll also put a link to the ASU clubs that you can click on and get to find out what clubs there are around campus.
There's also the Club Extravaganza. That was actually the event I was referring to in particular. But I don't know if they're going to do an online version or a mixed hybrid version of that. But anyway, just wanted to mention that.
And then someone says, if I missed the sessions yesterday, can I find them anywhere? They will be posted eventually. It takes a little bit of time for these videos to render and everything, and then we have to find, well, I'll be honest, Anna has to find the time to put them up on the website, but they will be up and you will be notified how you can get there. I was never taught how to take notes properly. Is there a place on campus that we could go to get some tips or something about how to take notes properly and to figure out which parts are important? So Anna did answer that and I answered some of it. I put some resources to YouTube. Anna found a textbook that's available through OpenStax and she put the link up there. And you can also talk to professors during office hours. You can go to some of the help centers and see if they can give you some advice. But I think actually those online sites are probably best because they give lots of different methods for taking notes, and you can find the one that works for you.
If I could join in, one of the things that came to mind, Jeff, when you were giving your presentation, was that one of the advantages perhaps of doing a lot of online learning is the kind of verbatim stuff when you're taking notes you don't have to do. Well, it depends on the course, but especially if you have a virtual course where you're looking at material, it's just posted material. You don't have to worry about trying to get all the details typed down in your own notes or handwritten in your own notes. So then this is a good opportunity to try to apply some of the lessons that Jeff was suggesting of like reading that material and then actively recording your notes by hand and going through some of those processes of thinking through patterns and whatever, because sometimes I find students get worried. They ask, for instance, are you going to post your PowerPoints or not? Because they don't want to lose that moment, like the stuff you had up there. But in this case, there's going to be less stuff that you'll lose, less of the detail that will disappear. So it's an opportunity to then, I think, to get rid of that concern and really focus on, okay, so how do I do this? If I'm doing handwritten notes, if I'm starting to tease out connections, and then review stuff, how do I do that? And I think this is a good, in some ways, maybe a less stressful opportunity to do that because there's less live stuff anyway.
Thank you, Jamie. I see we do have some other questions here, and Anonymous, we've seen Anonymous a lot the last few days. Anonymous asks, would you recommend not only studying in groups, but actually attending virtual class in groups? Well, that's interesting because what I would say is definitely yes. I think this year is teaching us a lot. And in fact, even when things go back to normal, I think there'll be a place for teams because you can quickly get together with a couple of friends, even if you're not on campus or in the same place. I think that would be fantastic idea to get together with friends. If you happen to have an iPad, you can even share your iPad over Teams and work with it. So, or you can get a webcam and work on paper and share those papers. There's ways of sharing files. So Teams is a fantastic collaboration tool. And in fact, I'm hoping that maybe in some of my classes, I'm going to continue to try and do teamwork, group work. I know students really don't like it when we force them to do group work, but group work is really important, not only as a method of learning, but the rest of your life you will be working in groups. So it's a pretty good idea to get used to doing that.
Jeff, can I add that I've had a few student hours where students come online because they're roommates, and so there's like 2 or 3 of them on the screen while I'm in my at my house, and so I've just loved that. And so I would really encourage my students, if they are, you know, sharing, are housemates, and they're in the same class, for my classes anyway, I think that would be great. And it would really engage them to, you know, participate in a different way. I think it's a great idea.
I agree, Mary, and one of the things I've always done in my office hours, when I have office hours, if there's more than one student that happens to show by, I try to get them all in. If the student wants to see something privately, but I try to talk to them in groups rather than repeat the same things over and over, and I'll be doing the same with my online office hours.
Yeah, I know. That's a piece that I'm worried about missing out on, is that when my doors open and students are coming and going. So yeah, I'm going to try to post, and I encourage other faculty, I think, are going to do this too, is to post your like office hours so more students can go to them other than just the people in your class.
Yeah.
So it encourages that kind of, you know, that
I miss that too, because often the classroom that's right by my office was empty, and we would just go in there, board, and have an impromptu tutorial. So working with multiple people, I think, is always best. And it works whether you're the one listening or you're the one talking. One of the best ways to learn things is to teach, actually. Okay. Will I be notified by my student email when videos are on the website? What did Anna tell us? She said, we send the videos over to another unit on campus. They will be posting the videos. We are not sure if it will be contracted, notified, or what they will, but they will appear in the Student Life website. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Jamie.
One other thing that I thought of in response to the earlier question about clubs, if you're coming in the second term, I suspect in some ways that might not be an advantage. I welcome everyone that's here at the start of this first term, but if you're coming in the second term, I think a lot of this will be archived, will be available on the website and different things. So you'll be able to, I think, see a lot of these sessions. And I suspect if there's like a club extravaganza, they'll work to have something available. And it might almost be more accessible and more available by the time we get around to second term. So like some years in a normal year, you might actually kind of miss out more by missing the start. But because most of us are adapting to some students being present, some not, I think you might almost be lucky in a way if you're coming into the second term to have those resources available.
Okay, Sue Foster asks, with all the readings we will have to do you think there is value to speed reading? I'm concerned about the best method for knowledge retention. Well, I don't know much about speed reading. I read at a decent speed. I never tried to do speed reading. I think if the comprehension is there, it should be fine. But again, the best way to read, I would say, is thoughtfully and with a pen and note paper in your hand. One of the things about textbooks, so most of us are of the era when we had textbooks. I think if you looked at a lot of our old textbooks, you would see writing in the margins. For me, anyway. How about anybody else? I always wrote in the margins of my textbooks. So as we've talked about, one of the best ways to learn is writing stuff. I don't know whether the knowledge goes from the paper through your arm into your brain, but it certainly seems to embed a lot better when you write. So although I think what Sue is concerned with is the volume, and what I would say there, a speed read might be a good thing for you to go through if you can do that for a first pass at it, and then maybe even with a pen or highlighter. The only thing I would recommend a highlighter be used for is to highlight areas you want to go over and think about how you're going to paraphrase and resynthesize that information. Anonymous asks, is the live event posted where can, oh, we've answered that. Sorry, I didn't. So, okay. Do any of the panelists want to say any last words?
I guess like for the speed reading too, and there's some trepidation around starting university, and just to, when you do get your syllabi from all your courses, just to read over them and really try, like as Anna said at the beginning, and it was reiterated through the whole thing, is to mark out your deadlines and your due dates, and to start early. And so that's something that I always really encourage my students to do, is to start your readings early. And every department has different expectations around reading. So if you're in English, for example, you'll be reading a lot more than perhaps another department, but to start early with your readings. And then if you do run into issues with keeping up, talk to your faculty or your professor, your instructor, sooner than later. So have that conversation sooner than later, or with your TA, and to have open communication. It's going to be a little bit more difficult virtually, but we're here for you. And if you come talk to us earlier than later, we can be much more helpful.
Yeah. And another thing I want to say, so here's a chemistry textbook, and it's giant. It's bigger than my cat. When you read this, you actually have to sit at a table and read it. So it's really conducive to having a notepad and a pen. And in terms of the way you read a textbook, I think it would be hard to speed read a chemistry textbook, because they're fairly dense, but what you will find is that you'll skip over lots of parts, and other parts you will read more thoughtfully and more slowly and taking notes. And then you will find things that don't require as much thoughtfulness, but it is important to figure out what you're having difficulties with. And so what I do now too, these books cost a lot of money. I found an open textbook that's free, but it's an online textbook. You can get hard copies for a considerably cheaper amount. But I always tell my students, if you're a chemistry major, it's well worth buying the introductory chemistry book. You'll go back to it. And we are trying to do things like find open texts and cheaper materials for you. But the reading is important in virtually every subject. I would say the readings are important to not skip over. Oh, come on. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great semester.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Have a great term.
Bye-bye.